All right, this is the finale, chapter 10 of Animal Farm. And here's something that happened. As soon as I hit end record on the last one, and you probably caught me, I didn't actually talk about the questions last time. And so, first, my apologies. I should have done that. I was just too emotionally moved by Boxer's death. Okay. So we're going to talk just briefly about the questions that were covered in that chapter. What does Boxer want to do before he retires? He wants to finish the windmill. Why does Moses return in chapter 9? Well, we don't know. I mean, it doesn't say this is why he did it, but we know that he's come back to talk to the workers who are working really way too hard and not getting enough food, and kind of promise them an afterlife, sugar candy mountain, so that after they die, they have at least things will get better, so to keep their morale up. How does Napoleon ensure that the pigs will rule in the future? Well, he has a bunch of babies, and he even spends money to build a new schoolhouse for them, and he keeps them separate from the other animals so that they, it's a separate status for his kids, his followers, right? Yeah. And what happens to Boxer when he can no longer work? He gets sent to the knackers, and the knacker is somebody who butchers hooved animals, boils down their bones, and makes glue, sells their hide, sells their meat to make dog food and things like that. That's what happened. I mean, that's not what Squealer said happened, but that's yeah. And so if you put down, oh, he died in the hospital, and Squealer said that his last words were, oh no, please don't fall for that. That's a bunch of garbage. And that's where we are right now. Now, it's really important, because this is a political allegory, to understand that George Orwell and Mrs. Olmos we're not speaking out against any one political system. It's really important. Orwell, of course, was critical of communism, because that's what the Soviet Union was trying out. At first, that's what they were going to do: communism, or more appropriately, socialism, at the very least, right? And often in our country, socialism is said like it's a bad word, but it's already integrated into our system already. Any kind of social program that we pay taxes to make sure that if somebody's unemployed, or they don't have insurance and they're sick, or they're old and they're retired, that we take care of that. And that's kind of like the last chapter, you're supposed to be able to retire, and you get money and you get taken care of, right? So those are social programs, and that's socialism. So we're very much a mix. But he wasn't saying nice things or bad things about one particular type of government. It's about humans and what humans do with whatever government they have. It's like, can you trust those who are in charge? The animals that are in charge, the pigs. Can you trust the pigs? The pigs have the dogs. They have the military. They have the police. They have the control of the money. They have the luxuries. They have the riches. Can you trust them? In what economic or government system can you trust them? Because now, if you were paying attention in the last chapter, it's now a republic and Napoleon's a president. So that's like us. And they're definitely a capitalist state, because they're selling things for money. They're making money off of their things now. They're not just spreading the labor and the goods equally. So it doesn't matter which government you're a fan of. That's not what this is about. This is about how humans treat each other and interact in political systems. And we'll get to the end and we'll talk about what that could possibly mean, okay? All right, chapter 10. Years passed. The seasons came and went. The short animals' lives fled by. A time came when there was no one who remembered the old days before the rebellion, except Clover, Benjamin, Moses the raven, and a number of the pigs. Muriel was dead. Bluebell, Jessie, and Pincher were dead. Jones, too, was dead. He had died in an inebriate's home in another part of the country. Snowball was forgotten. Boxer was forgotten except by the few who had known him. Clover was an old stout mare now, stiff in the joints and with a tendency to rheumy eyes. She was 2 years past the retiring age, but in fact no animal had ever actually retired. The talk of setting aside a corner of the pasture for superannuated animals had long since been dropped. Napoleon was now a mature boar of 24 stone. Squealer was so fat that he could with difficulty see out of his eyes. Only old Benjamin was much the same as ever, except for being a little grayer about the muzzle, and since Boxer's death, more morose and taciturn than ever. There were many more creatures on the farm now, though the increase was not so great as it had been expected in earlier years. Many animals had been born to whom the rebellion was only a dim tradition, passed on by word of mouth, and others had been bought who had never heard mention of such a thing before their arrival. The farm possessed 3 horses now besides Clover. They were fine, upstanding beasts, willing workers, and good comrades, but very stupid. None of them proved able to learn the alphabet beyond the letter B. They accepted everything they were told about the rebellion and the principles of animalism, especially from Clover, for whom they had an almost filial respect, but it was doubtful whether they understood very much of it. The farm was more prosperous now and better organized. It had even been enlarged by 2 fields, which had been bought from Mr. Pilkington. The windmill had been successfully completed at last, and the farm possessed a threshing machine and a hay elevator of its own, and various new buildings had been added to it. Whymper had bought himself a dog cart. It's a cart pulled by a horse. The windmill, however, had not after all been used for generating electrical power. It was used for milling corn and brought in a handsome money profit. The animals were hard at work building yet another windmill. When that was finished, so it was said, the dynamos would be installed. But the luxuries of which Snowball had once taught the animals to dream, the stalls with electric light and hot and cold water and the 3-day week, were no longer talked about. Napoleon had denounced such ideas as contrary to the spirit of animalism. The truest happiness, he said, lay in working hard and living frugally. Somehow it seemed as though the farm had grown richer without making the animals themselves any richer, except, of course, for the pigs and the dogs. Perhaps this was partly because there were so many pigs and so many dogs. It was not that these creatures did not work after their fashion. There was, as Squealer was never tired of explaining, endless work in the supervision and organization of the farm. Much of this work was of a kind that the other animals were too ignorant to understand. For example, Squealer told them that the pigs had to expend enormous labors every day upon mysterious things called files, reports, minutes, and memoranda. These were large sheets of paper which had to be closely covered with writing, and as soon as they were so covered, they were burnt in the furnace. This was the highest importance for the welfare of the farm, Squealer said. But still, neither pigs nor dogs produced any food by their own labor, and there were very many of them, and their appetites were always good. As for the others, their life, so far as they knew, was as it had always been. They were generally hungry, they slept on straw, they drank from the pool, they labored in the fields. In winter, they were troubled by the cold, and in summer by the flies. Sometimes the older ones among them racked their dim memories and tried to determine whether in the early days of the rebellion, when Jones's expulsion was still recent, things had been better or worse than now. They could not remember. There was nothing with which they could compare their present lives. They had nothing to go upon except Squealer's list of figures, which invariably demonstrated that everything was getting better and better. The animals found the problem insoluble. In any case, they had little time for speculating on such things now. Only old Benjamin professed to remember every detail of his long life and to know that things never had been nor ever could be much better or much worse. Hunger, hardship, and disappointment being, so he said, the unalterable law in life. And yet the animals never gave up hope. More, they never lost, even for an instant, their sense of honor and privilege in being members of Animal Farm. They were still the only farm in the whole country, in all England, owned and operated by animals. Not one of them, not even the youngest, not even the newcomers who had been brought from farms 10 or 20 miles away, ever ceased to marvel at that. And when they heard the gun booming and saw the green flag fluttering at the masthead, their hearts swelled with imperishable pride. And the talk turned always towards the old heroic days, the expulsion of Jones, the writing of the 7 Commandments, the great battles in which the human invaders had been defeated. None of the old dreams had been abandoned. The Republic of the Animals, which Major had foretold, when the green fields of England should be untrodden by human feet, was still believed in. Someday it was coming. It might not be soon. It might not be within the lifetime of any animal now living, but still it was coming. Even the tune of Beasts of England was perhaps hummed secretly here and there. At any rate, it was a fact that every animal on the farm knew it, though no one would have dared to sing it aloud. It might be that their lives were hard and that not all their hopes had been fulfilled, but they were conscious that they were not as other animals. If they went hungry, it was not from feeding tyrannical human beings. If they worked hard, at least they worked for themselves. No creature among them went upon two legs. No creature called any other creature master. All animals were equal. Okay, so relate this to the human story of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Soviet Union. Even though times were hard, they could say that they were the only communist nation in which everyone was equal and everybody was to get equal share and they weren't being ruled by tyrants. Do you think that they're being ruled by tyrants? They say that nobody goes on two legs and they don't have to call anybody master. And that means that they are, in effect, their own masters. And that is better than how it ever could have been if humans were over them. And remember, this isn't a story about humans and animals. This is a story about humans and humans. So keep that in mind as we finish her up, okay? One day in early summer, Squealer ordered the sheep to follow him and led them out to a piece of waste ground at the other end of the farm, which had become overgrown with birch saplings. The sheep spent the whole day there, browsing at the leaves under Squealer's supervision. In the evening, he returned to the farmhouse himself, but as it was warm weather, told the sheep to stay where they were. It ended by their remaining there for a whole week, during which time the other animals saw nothing of them. Squealer was with them for the greater part of every day. He was, he said, teaching them to sing a new song for which privacy was needed. So Squealer's taking the sheep off by themselves and spending all his time with them. We'll find out why. It was just after the sheep had returned on a pleasant evening when the animals had finished work and were making their way back to the farm buildings that the terrified neighing of a horse sounded from the yard. Startled, the animals stopped in their tracks. It was Clover's voice. She neighed again, and all the animals broke into a gallop and rushed into the yard. Then they saw what Clover had seen. It was a pig walking on his hind legs. Yes, it was Squealer. A little awkwardly, as though not quite used to supporting his considerable bulk in that position, but with perfect balance, he was strolling across the yard. And a moment later, out from the door of the farmhouse came a long file of pigs, all walking on their hind legs. Some did it better than others. One or two were even a trifle unsteady and looked as though they would have liked the support of a stick, but every one of them made his way right round the yard successfully. And finally, there was a tremendous baying of dogs and a shrill crowing from the black cockerel, and out came Napoleon himself, majestically upright, casting haughty glances from side to side, and with his dogs gambolling round him. He carried a whip in his trotter. There was a deadly silence. Amazed, terrified, huddling together, the animals watched the long line of pigs march slowly round the yard. It was as though the world had turned upside down. Then there came a moment when the first shock had worn off, and when, in spite of everything, in spite of their terror of the dogs, of the habit developed through long years of never complaining, never criticizing, no matter what happened, they might have uttered some word of protest, but just at that moment, as though at a signal, all the sheep burst out into a tremendous bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs better, 4 legs good, 2 legs better, 4 legs good, 2 legs better. It went on for 5 minutes without stopping, and by the time the sheep had quieted down, the chance to utter any protest had passed, for the pigs had marched back into the farmhouse. Benjamin felt a nose nuzzling at his shoulder. He looked round. It was Clover. Her old eyes looked dimmer than ever. Without saying anything, she tugged gently at his mane and led him round to the end of the big barn, where the 7 commandments were written. For a minute or two, they stood gazing at the tattered wall with its white lettering. My sight is failing, she said finally. Even when I was young, I could not have read what was written there. But it appears to me that wall looks different. Are the 7 commandments the same as they used to be, Benjamin? For once, Benjamin consented to break his rule, and he read out to her what was written on the wall. There was nothing there now except a single commandment. It ran, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." After that, it did not seem strange when next day the pigs who were supervising the work of the farm all carried whips in their trotters. It did not seem strange to learn that the pigs had bought themselves a wireless set, were arranging to install a telephone, and had taken out subscriptions to John Bull, Titbits, and the Daily Mirror. It did not seem strange when Napoleon was seen strolling in the farmhouse garden with a pipe in his mouth. No, not even when the pigs took Mr. Jones's clothes out of his wardrobes and put them on. Napoleon himself appearing in a black coat, ratcatcher breeches, and leather leggings, while his favorite sow appeared in the watered silk dress which Mrs. Jones had been used to wearing on Sundays. A week later, in the afternoon, a number of dog carts drove up to the farm. A deputation of neighboring farmers had been invited to make a tour of inspection. They were shown all over the farm and expressed great admiration for everything they saw, especially the windmill. The animals were weeding the turnip field. They worked diligently, hardly raising their faces from the ground, and not knowing whether to be more frightened of the pigs or of the human visitors. That evening, loud laughter and bursts of singing came from the farmhouse. And suddenly, at the sound of the mingled voices, the animals were stricken with curiosity. What could be happening in there, now that for the first time the animals and the human beings were meeting on terms of equality? With one accord, they began to creep as quietly as possible into the farmhouse garden. At the gate, they paused, half frightened to go on, but Clover led the way, and they tiptoed up to the house, and such animals as were tall enough peered in at the dining room window. There, round the long table, sat half a dozen farmers and half a dozen of the more eminent pigs, Napoleon himself occupying the seat of honor at the head of the table. The pigs appeared completely at ease in their chairs. The company had been enjoying a game of cards, but had broken off for a moment, evidently in order to drink a toast. A large jug was circulating, and the mugs were being refilled with beer. No one noticed the wondering faces of the animals that gazed in at the window. Mr. Pilkington of Foxwood had stood up, his mug in his hand. In a moment he said he would ask the present company to drink a toast, but before doing so, there were a few words that he felt it incumbent upon him to say. It was a source of great satisfaction to him, he said, and he was sure to all others present to feel that a long period of mistrust and misunderstanding had now come to an end. There had been a time, not that he or any of the present company had shared such sentiments, but there had been a time when the respected proprietors of Animal Farm had been regarded, he would not say with hostility, but perhaps with a certain measure of misgiving by their human neighbors. Unfortunate incidents had occurred. Mistaken ideas had been current. It had been felt that the existence of a farm owned and operated by pigs was somehow abnormal and was liable to have an unsettling effect in the neighborhood. Too many farmers had assumed without due inquiry that on such a farm a spirit of license and indiscipline would prevail. They had been nervous about the effects upon their own animals or even upon their human employees. But all such doubts were now dispelled. Today he and his friends had visited Animal Farm and inspected every inch of it with their own eyes. And what did they find? Not only the most up-to-date methods, but a discipline and orderliness which should be an example to all farmers everywhere. He believed that he was right in saying that the lower animals on Animal Farm did more work and received less food than any animals in the county. Indeed, he and his fellow visitors today had observed many features which they intended to introduce on their own farms immediately. He would end his remarks, he said, by emphasizing once again the friendly feelings that subsisted and ought to subsist between Animal Farm and its neighbors. Between pigs and human beings, there was not, and there need not be, any clash of interests whatever. Their struggles and their difficulties were one. Was not the labor problem the same everywhere? Here it became apparent that Mr. Pilkington was about to spring some carefully prepared witticism on the company, but for a moment he was too overcome by amusement to be able to utter it. After much choking, during which his various chins turned purple, he managed to get it out. "If you have your lower animals to contend with," he said, "we have our lower classes." This bon mot, that's French, this good thing, set the table in a roar, and Mr. Pilkington once again congratulated the pigs on the low rations, the long working hours, and the general absence of pampering which he had observed on Animal Farm. So he's saying, we have lower classes. You pigs have lower classes too. And you got them working hard for very little. Good job. And now, he said finally, he would ask the company to rise to their feet and make certain that their glasses were full. Gentlemen, concluded Mr. Pilkington, gentlemen, I give you a toast to the prosperity of Animal Farm. There was enthusiastic cheering and stamping of feet. Napoleon was so gratified that he left his place and came round the table to clink his mug against Mr. Pilkington's before emptying it. When the cheering had died down, Napoleon, who had remained on his feet, intimated that he too had a few words to say. Like all of Napoleon's speeches, it was short and to the point. He too, he said, was happy that the period of misunderstanding was at an end. For a long time there had been rumors circulated, he had reason to think, by some malignant enemy, that there was something subversive and even revolutionary in the outlook of himself and his colleagues. They had been credited with attempting to stir up rebellion among the animals on neighboring farms. Nothing could be further from the truth. Their sole wish now, and in the past, was to live at peace and in normal business relations with their neighbors. This farm, which he had the honor to control, he added, was a cooperative enterprise. The title deeds, which were in his own possession, were owned by the pigs jointly. Not owned by all the animals, owned by the pigs. He did not believe, he said, that any of the old suspicions still lingered, but certain changes had been made recently in the routine of the farm, which should have the effect of promoting confidence still further. Hitherto, the animals on the farm had had a rather foolish custom of addressing one another as comrade. This was to be suppressed. There had also been a very strange custom, whose origin was unknown, of marching every Sunday morning past a boar's skull which was nailed to a post in the garden. This too would be suppressed, and the skull had already been buried. His visitors might have observed too the green flag which flew from the masthead. If so, they would perhaps have noted that the white hoof and horn with which it had been previously marked had now been removed. It'd be a plain green flag from now onwards. He had only one criticism, he said, to make of Mr. Pilkington's excellent and neighborly speech. Mr. Pilkington had referred throughout to Animal Farm. He could not, of course, know, for he, Napoleon, was only now for the first time announcing it, that the name Animal Farm had been abolished. Henceforward, the farm was to be known as the Manor Farm, which he believed was its correct and original name. Gentlemen, concluded Napoleon, I will give you the same toast as before, but in a different form. Fill your glasses to the brim. Gentlemen, here is my toast to the prosperity of the Manor Farm. There was the same hearty cheering as before, and the mugs were emptied to the dregs, but as the animals outside gazed at the scene, it seemed to them that some strange thing was happening. What was it that had altered in the faces of the pigs? Clover's old dim eyes flitted from one face to another. Some of them had 5 chins, some had 4, some had 3. But what was it that seemed to be melting and changing? Then, the applause having come to an end, the company took up their cards and continued the game that had been interrupted, and the animals crept silently away. But they had not gone 20 yards when they stopped short. An uproar of voices was coming from the farmhouse. They rushed back and looked through the window again. Yes, a violent quarrel was in progress. There were shoutings, bangings on the table, sharp, suspicious glances, furious denials. The source of the trouble appeared to be that of Napoleon and Mr. Pilkington had each played an ace of spades simultaneously. 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. All right, we only have a few questions left in the discussion. Why did the pigs change the 4 legs good motto? Well, so they can start acting like humans and walk on 2 legs. And Squealer makes sure that the sheep are there to support them. Their chanting of the new motto, that 4 legs good, 2 legs better. Okay. And that's how they once and for all show and assert their dominance over every other animal. In what ways do the pigs begin to act like humans? Multiple ways. Walking on 2 legs, carrying whips, dressing in clothes, inviting the other humans over, drinking alcohol, playing cards, owning the property. And what is significant about the scene at the end where the animals cannot tell the pigs from the humans? Well, the whole scene is significant because clearly everything's gone back to the way it was, if not worse. They aren't just acting like humans. The animals looking in can't even tell the difference. They have become the same exact thing that the animals wanted to get away from in the first place. The Soviet Union, similarly, when they became allies of the other countries, when they had to go against Hitler, had to make at least some outward changes about how they conducted communism. Communism stopped being so much about everybody is equal and became a whole lot more about the elite members of the party got to do their own business, and the people, the more common people, had it worse than ever before. And that's why communism in the Soviet Union ended, because people rose up and said, this isn't working for us. So think about what the animals are experiencing here. Why did it go wrong? How did it go wrong? And the pigs were the intellectuals, the ones who understood and knew things. They took control. The more powerful ones and eventually took control. And then when it became to their advantage to take more and more control and abuse the other animals and the other animals' ignorance and good natures, then they took advantage of that. Until in the end, they were just as bad as the drunken farmer who underfed them and slaughtered them in the beginning. They were the same. And that is Animal Farm. So now you're going to be able to discuss that for the end, till the end of time, when people bring up things about politics. And in your packet that you received, there are, I'm just going to mention them, some related readings. So here, this is mirrored, obviously, but you've got one that's called The Story of Mouseland. And it's a story that was told by a politician in Canada. And it was basically, it's a very short one-page allegory, okay, told about a place called Mouseland where mice lived. And they end up holding an election, and they have to read it, but they vote. They vote in a cat to be the leader of Mouseland. What could go wrong? And then the next page has the song Beasts of England from the book, and a poem by Maya Angelou, who's an African-American poet. And it's basically a poem about slavery and about, working hard. All you have left is basically to work hard. It's called One More Round. If you compare the two a little bit, you can see some similarities, at least in the tone and the idea. And on the back page, we have two things. A tiny little fable, one of Aesop's fables, and it's called The Hawk, the Kite, and the Pigeons. And I'll go ahead and just read that to you really quick. That one's royalty free. The pigeons, terrified by the appearance of a kite, called upon the hawk to defend them. He at once consented. When they had admitted him to the cote, they found that he made more havoc and slew a large number of them in one day than the kite could pounce upon in a whole year. Okay, and the moral, avoid a remedy that is worse than the disease. There's a lot of explanation that went with it too, but a kite is a smaller bird of prey. So when the pigeons in their cote where they live were afraid of one bad bird, they called on a hawk to get rid of it, and then the hawk then did more damage. Okay, between that and the cat in The Story of Mouseland, you should see some parallels. Like, the animals needed to get rid of the bad Mr. Jones. They got the pigs, and the problem maybe got worse. Okay, and then finally, this is a political cartoon dealing with an issue, a ruling about how we can influence politics. And this is current events right here, friends. It's not a brand new political cartoon, but it's about how rich people and corporations can spend a lot of money on politicians. And most of us, I would say all of us, kind of think that's a bad idea, except for the politicians. So if you are Jeff Bezos, or you are Bill Gates, or you are any of the rich dudes, you can figure out how to spend money to get politics to do what you want. And so the caption up here says, all speech is equal. Some speech is more equal than others. So the ruling that the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission is money spent by corporations to influence politics is a form of free speech and cannot be limited by the government. So you've got $1 billion and you want to give it to a politician for their campaign, that's considered free speech. That sounds like one person getting a whole lot of influence is what that sounds like. Those are our pigs, so to speak. I apologize to Jeff Bezos and to any other billionaires out there that find that offensive. You're probably not watching my video. But that's the allegory of Animal Farm shows up in the newspaper, and it's that scene where Squealer had changed the rules. The rules change when you're not paying attention. It's another message from Animal Farm. Okay, behind those related readings, you will find the assessment. The assessment is some multiple choice that you have to put down evidence of. You have to mark your answer, but then you have to use something from the text to back up why you said it. And then there's another section that has some places that you have to answer in a little short answer. Just do your best with that. Okay? Let me know if you struggle, because we're all in this together. And then finally, not finally, but nearly finally, there's a section where you have to connect it to the related readings. So use them in part of your evidence. And then finally, the last page has one little essay about comparing Snowball and Napoleon. So you have to go back a little bit on that. And then down here, this is where you're going to get that extra credit for knowing the who the different animals stood for, what social classes and or actual humans that they were representing. Okay. Try to come to our Zoom meeting on Thursdays and ask any questions. Basically, anybody who shows up, anybody who watches these, and anybody who shows up to the Zoom meetings is just going to get answers loaded onto you. We aren't trying to make you work too hard right now. We're trying to engage you in some curiosity. When we're in these weird situations like a pandemic and some isolation and things like that, keeping our brain actively thinking about concepts, even if they're not like the most pleasant or fun ones, like the ideas of Animal Farm, still has that curiosity, and it releases some good chemicals in here. So let's do some learning together. Get in touch with me if you still have questions. That is Animal Farm. Thanks for watching.